Support for mapping annotation attribute values in the Spring environment, auto configuration for tests using Spring REST docs, auto configuration for web client, auto configuration for reactive web test, auto configuration for Spring MVC test, auto configuration for web service client, auto configuration for web service server test, classes and annotations related to configuring Spring's application context for text test, Assert.j support for application context, test utilities to run application context for testing, support for testing JSON, Makito integration for Spring Boot test, mock web classes specific to Spring Boot, RSocket server test utilities and support classes, classes for system-related testing, general purpose test utilities, web client test utilities, HTML unit support classes, Selenium support classes, Spring Boot support for testing, Spring Webflux server endpoint via web test client, web server test utilities and support classes, Spring Bean support classes for test containers, Spring Context support classes for test containers, utilities and helpers to allow the test containers to be used in a Spring application context, dynamic container properties support, general support for service connections in test, support classes for reading annotation and class level metadata, contains miscellaneous utility classes, utilities and classes related to validation, utilities and classes related to bean validation, web client utilities, support for web-based codecs, web integrations with Spring's application context, embedded reactive and servlet web server implementations backed by Jetty, embedded reactive web server implementation backed by Netty, embedded reactive and servlet web server implementations backed by Tomcat, embedded reactive and servlet web server implementations backed by Undertow. Spring Web Error Handling Infrastructure, reactive-based web app integrations with Spring's application context, Spring Webflux Error Handling Infrastructure, Spring Boot specific web filter implementations, Spring Webflux Web Client to support abstractions, additional views for use with Webflux, reactive web server abstractions, support for embedded web servers, classes and utilities designed to work with a Jakarta.servlet specification, servlet-based web integrations with Spring's web application context, Spring MVC error handling infrastructure, Spring Boot specific filter implementations, servlet web server abstractions, support classes for servlet-based web servers, additional views for use with Web MVC, web services client utilities.